Deep within the historic seaside enclave of Newport, Rhode Island, there stands a structure that defies the typical expectations of American architectural history. A place where the grandeur of the Gilded Age meets a darker, more enigmatic legacy that has fueled local legends for over a century. This is Belcourt of Newport, formerly known as Belcourt Castle, a massive estate that was never intended to be a mere summer cottage like its neighbors, but was instead conceived as a monumental tribute to a man's obsession with the chivalric past and his literal love for his horses. To understand the strange energy that visitors claim permeates the halls of Belcourt today, one must first travel back to the late 19th century, a time when Newport was the playground of the ultra-wealthy, a stage where the titans of industry built limestone monuments to their own success. However, while the Vanderbilts and the Astors were building palaces for social climbing and ballroom dancing, Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont was building something entirely different. Born into immense wealth and a prestigious naval lineage, Oliver was a man of eccentric tastes and a somewhat rebellious spirit who found himself dissatisfied with the rigid social structures of his era. He commissioned the famed architect Richard Morris Hunt, the same man responsible for the breakers in Biltmore, to design a home that reflected his unique passions. Construction began in 1891 and was completed in 1894, costing millions of dollars at a time when such a sum was unfathomable. What Hunt delivered was a 60-room French Renaissance and Gothic masterpiece inspired by the Louis XIII hunting lodge at Versailles. But the layout of the original Belcourt was the first sign that this was no ordinary home. The entire first floor was not designed for humans at all, but was instead a massive, palatial stable and carriage house. Oliver Belmont loved his horses more than most of his contemporary peers, and he insisted that they live in the same luxury as he did. He supposedly had his horses tucked in at night with fine linen sheets, and they were groomed and cared for by a staff that outnumbered the servants in many other Newport mansions. The second floor housed the living quarters, including a massive Gothic ballroom and a grand library. But to reach them, one had to pass through the domain of the animals. This inversion of the natural order, placing the beasts on the foundation and the master above, is often cited by researchers of the paranormal as the beginning of the home's unusual spiritual history. The design was intensely masculine, filled with heavy wood, stained glass, and suit after suit of medieval armor. Oliver filled the rooms with an enormous collection of European and Oriental antiquities, many of which were centuries old, and carried their own long-forgotten histories. There are those who believe that objects can retain a psychic imprint of their previous owners, and if that is true, Belcourt was being populated by thousands of silent witnesses from the Crusades, the Renaissance, and the courts of French kings. For a few years, Oliver lived there as a bachelor, surrounded by his horses and his relics, but the story of Belcourt took a dramatic turn when he became involved in one of the greatest scandals of the Gilded Age. He fell in love with Alva Vanderbilt, the former wife of his close friend William Kissam Vanderbilt. Alva was a force of nature, a woman who had forced her way into the highest echelons of New York society and was now seeking a different kind of power. After her sensational divorce, she married Oliver in 1896 and immediately set about transforming Belcourt from a bachelor's eccentric stable into a functional social palace. She had the stables moved and redesigned the interior to include more traditional living spaces, though she could never fully erase the Gothic, brooding atmosphere that Oliver and Hunt had baked into the very stones of the building. The couple shared a few years of opulence and political ambition, as Oliver eventually entered Congress, but their time together was cut short when Oliver died unexpectedly in 1908 following a sudden bout of appendicitis. His death left Alva in control of the massive estate, but her interests were shifting toward the women's suffrage movement, and Belcourt began its long transition from a vibrant home to a place of memory and eventually, a place of mystery. As the decades passed and the Gilded Age faded into the hardships of the Great Depression and the World Wars, the grand Newport estates became increasingly difficult to maintain. Belcourt fell into a period of neglect and decline, its many rooms gathering dust while the artifacts inside sat in silence. The heavy stone walls seemed to soak up the salt air and the passage of time, and it was during these years of quiet that the first whispers of strange occurrences began to circulate among the skeleton crew of caretakers. They spoke of footsteps in the empty ballroom, of the feeling of being watched by the suits of armor, and of the way the temperature would suddenly drop in the library even on a humid Rhode Island afternoon. The house was eventually sold out of the Belmont family in the 1940s, passing through several hands, and even facing the threat of demolition, a fate that befell many other Newport mansions that were deemed too expensive to keep. It was not until the Tinney family purchased the estate in 1954 that the modern era of Belcourt Castle truly began. Harold and Ruth Tinney, along with their son Donald, were not just looking for a home. They were looking for a museum for their own massive collection of art and artifacts. They spent decades restoring the property, filling it with even more antique furniture, religious icons, and strange curiosities from around the globe. It was during the Tinney era that the paranormal reputation of Belcourt exploded into the public consciousness. Donald Tinney in particular became a central figure in the home's lore, often recounting tales of the various entities that he believed shared the house with his family. The collection grew so large and eclectic that the house became a maze of history, where a 16th century chair might sit next to a 19th century mirror, creating a chaotic psychic landscape. Visitors who came for tour began to report inexplicable experiences, particularly in the ballroom and the chapel. People claimed to feel a crushing weight on their chests when sitting in certain chairs, or they would see reflections in mirrors that did not match the people standing in front of them. One of the most famous stories involves a set of chairs that were allegedly carved with such intense emotion that anyone who sat in them would feel a sense of overwhelming dread or physical illness. The Tinney family did not shy away from these stories, instead embracing them as part of the home's unique character. They understood that Belcourt was more than just stone and mortar. It was a vessel for the past, and that past was not always content to remain buried. The house itself seemed to have a personality, one that was sometimes welcoming and sometimes intensely hostile to those who entered with ill intentions or a lack of respect for the history contained within. As we look at the facade of Belcourt today, with its towering chimneys and intricate stonework, we see the architectural embodiment of a man's dream and a family's dedication, but we also see a gateway to something far less tangible. The history of the Belmonts and the Tinneys provides the framework, but the true story of Belcourt lies in the shadows between the artifacts and the echoes in the vaulted ceilings. Why did Oliver Belmont feel the need to surround himself with the remnants of the medieval world? What did Alva Vanderbilt feel when she walked through the halls that had been built for horses? And what was it about the Tinney family that allowed them to live for over 50 years in a house that many others found terrifying? These questions serve as the foundation for our exploration into the depths of Belcourt. We must peel back the layers of Newport society, architectural ambition, and personal tragedy to find the heart of this singular American castle. The atmosphere of the house is heavy with the scent of old wood and the weight of centuries, a place where the line between the living and the dead feels remarkably thin. As we move forward, we will examine the specific artifacts that are said to be haunted, the tragic events that occurred on the grounds, and the scientific and spiritual investigations that have attempted to solve the riddles of Belcourt. But before we can understand the ghosts, we must understand the men and women who built the stage upon which they walk. The story of Belcourt is a story of excess and eccentricity, but it is also a story of a search for meaning in a rapidly changing world. It is a place where the Gilded Age never truly ended, but instead curdled into something far more mysterious and enduring. To truly grasp the architectural anomaly that is Belcourt, one must look closer at the specific vision Richard Morris Hunt translated from Oliver Belmont's restless mind into the very limestone of Newport. The year 1891 marked the beginning of a construction project that confused the local socialites, who were used to seeing Italianate villas and French chateaux rising along Bellevue Avenue. Oliver was not interested in the light, airy aesthetics of a summer getaway. He wanted a fortress of masculinity and a sanctuary for his most prized possessions. The site chosen was a large plot of land that offered enough room for what would essentially become a massive, enclosed square around a central courtyard. As the foundation was laid, the sheer scale of the stable area became apparent, and the rumors began to fly through the parlors of the neighboring mansions. While other men of his status were investing in yachts or railroads, Oliver was obsessed with the details of his 60-horse stable. The stalls were not made of simple timber. They were fashioned from polished mahogany and accented with gleaming brass fixtures. Each stall featured a nameplate for the horse residing within, and the floors were covered in specialized mats to ensure the animal's comfort. This was the era of the horse and carriage, yet Oliver's devotion went far beyond utility. He viewed the horse as the ultimate symbol of the chivalric code he so admired. To him, the ground floor of Belcourt was a cathedral to the spirit of the knightly Middle Ages. When visitors entered through the massive carriage doors, they weren't greeted by a grand staircase or a butler in a tuxedo, but by the smell of hay, leather, and expensive horseflesh. The carriages themselves were works of art, ranging from sleek racing curricles to heavy, ornate coaches used for formal processions. The transition from this animal-centric ground floor to the living quarters above was achieved through a series of grand, winding staircases that felt more like passages in a European castle than a Rhode Island home. As the walls rose, the interior began to take on the heavy, somber atmosphere that defines the property to this day. Hunt utilized massive oak beams, intricate plasterwork, and vast expanses of stained glass that filtered the bright Atlantic sunlight into pools of deep crimson, emerald, and violet. This was the setting into which Oliver began to pour his massive collection of antiquities. He was a voracious collector, often buying entire rooms of paneling or massive fireplaces from crumbling European estates and shipping them across the ocean to be integrated into Belcourt. One of the most striking features was the Gothic ballroom, a space so large and imposing that it felt less like a room for dancing and more like a hall for a medieval king to hold court. The ceiling was a masterpiece of timber framing, and the walls were lined with the aforementioned suits of armor, some of which dated back to the 1500s. It is said that Oliver would often sit alone in this room, surrounded by these silent metal sentinels, perhaps imagining a time when the world was governed by the sword and a rigid code of honor rather than the fluctuating stock market of the late 19th century. The library was equally impressive, filled with thousands of leather-bound volumes and featuring a massive fireplace that could fit several grown men inside its hearth. However, the energy of the house changed significantly when Alva Vanderbilt entered the picture. Alva was a woman who understood the power of architecture as a weapon of social warfare. She had already built Marble House just down the street, a structure so opulent it helped define the Gilded Age. When she married Oliver, she brought a different kind of intensity to Belcourt. She recognized that the house, as Oliver had designed it, was a bachelor's dream but a hostess's nightmare. There was no proper kitchen for a grand household, no bedrooms for female guests, and the presence of 60 horses directly beneath the main living areas created an olfactory challenge that even the most expensive perfumes could not mask. Alva immediately commissioned renovations to make the house more livable by the standards of high society, though she respected Oliver's Gothic vision enough to keep the core aesthetic intact. She transformed the upper floors into a maze of guest rooms and sitting areas, each filled with priceless French furniture and silk tapestries. Yet, even with Alva's touch of elegance, the house remained stubbornly dark. It was during this period of the late 1890s that the social life of Belcourt reached its zenith. The gates were opened for legendary parties where the cream of New York and Newport society would gather. Imagine the scene of horse-drawn carriages clattering into the central courtyard, the gaslights flickering against the grey stone, and the sound of music drifting down from the Gothic ballroom. But even then, guests spoke of a strange heaviness in the air. Some attributed it to the sheer amount of ancient objects packed into the rooms, while others felt it was the result of Oliver's own brooding personality. The marriage of Oliver and Alva was a partnership of two massive egos, and their combined energy seemed to imprint itself onto the house. They were champions of the emerging world, yet they lived in a shell of the old world. As Oliver's health began to decline in the early 1900s, the atmosphere of the house shifted again. He spent more time in his private study, surrounded by his books and his relics, as the vibrant social life Alva had cultivated began to quiet down. When he passed away in 1908, the heart of the original Belcourt seemed to stop beating. Alva, ever the pragmatist, did not wallow in grief. She turned her formidable energy toward the cause of women's rights, using Belcourt as a headquarters for suffrage rallies and meetings. She even had a Chinese tea house built on the grounds of her other property, but Belcourt remained her primary base of operations in Newport. The image of suffragettes marching through the Gothic halls of a man who built his home for horses and armor is one of the great ironies of the estate's history. It was a clash of eras, the medieval fantasies of Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont meeting the progressive, forward-looking fire of Alva Vanderbilt. However, the high costs of maintaining such a massive and unconventional structure began to take their toll. After Alva moved to France in the later years of her life, the house entered a period of transition that bordered on abandonment. The grand parties were a memory, and the horses were long gone from the mahogany stalls. The house sat through the winter gales of the Atlantic, the salt spray eating away at the window frames and the dampness seeping into the tapestries. It was during this fallow period, before the tinnies arrived to save it, that the local legends truly began to take root. People claimed that on foggy nights, you could still hear the ghost of a carriage pulling into the courtyard, or the rhythmic thud of hooves on the stable floor even though the stalls were empty. Caretakers who were hired to watch over the property reported that they refused to enter certain rooms after dark, claiming that the suits of armor seemed to shift their positions when no one was looking. There were stories of a lady in white seen peering out of the upper windows, though no one could say for sure who she might be. Was it Alva, returning to check on her domain, or was it a spirit attached to one of the many ancient artifacts Oliver had brought into the home? The house was becoming a focal point for the unexplained, a massive stone sponge absorbing the stories and the spirits of everyone who had ever crossed its threshold. By the time the mid-20th century rolled around, Belcourt was a fatting giant, a relic of an era that the world was eager to forget in the wake of the world wars. It stood as a silent witness to the end of the Gilded Age, its halls filled with shadows and the lingering echoes of a flamboyant, eccentric past. The sale of the house to the Tinney family in the 1950s would mark the beginning of its public life as a haunted castle, but the seeds of that haunting were planted decades earlier, in the obsessions of a man who loved the past more than the present. As we continue this journey, we will look into the specific artifacts the Tinneys brought into the home, and how their arrival acted as a catalyst for a surge in paranormal activity that would eventually make Belcourt one of the most famous haunted locations in New England. The transition from a family home to a public museum opened the doors for thousands of people to experience the Belcourt energy for themselves, leading to a wealth of documented encounters that defy easy explanation. We are only just beginning to scratch the surface of the mysteries hidden within these walls, where the line between history and legend is perpetually blurred. When the Tinney family arrived at the gates of Belcourt in 1954, they were not just purchasing a dilapidated mansion. They were stepping into a vacuum of history that was waiting to be filled. Harold Tinney, his wife Ruth, and their son Donald represented a new chapter for the estate, one defined by an almost obsessive dedication to restoration and the accumulation of the esoteric. They changed the name to Belcourt Castle, a move that reflected their vision of the property as a regal sanctuary for the arts rather than just a summer residence. The Tinneys were a unique family, possessing a deep knowledge of craftsmanship and a relentless drive to salvage the grandeur of the past. When they took possession of the keys, the house was in a state of profound disarray. The salt air had corroded the plumbing, the roof leaked in dozens of places, and the vast rooms were empty of the life that had once pulsed through them during the Belmont years. However, the Tinneys saw potential where others saw ruin. They began a multi-decade project of hands-on restoration, often doing the physical labor themselves. Harold was a master of woodworking and metalwork, and Donald shared his father's passion for the tactile history of objects. They didn't just want to fix the house. They wanted to enhance its mystical and regal character. This led to the importation of massive amounts of furniture, architectural elements, and religious relics from all over the world. As these objects began to fill the 60 rooms, the atmosphere of the house began to thicken. It wasn't just the sheer volume of things. It was the nature of the things they chose. They brought in massive carved sideboards from German monasteries, ornate mirrors from French palaces, and a significant amount of religious statuary that seemed to carry an air of solemnity and ancient devotion. The Tinneys believed that Belcourt was a living entity, and as they added more to its collection, the house seemed to respond. It was during these early years of the Tinney era that the paranormal phenomena began to be documented with more frequency and intensity. The family lived on the upper floors, but they spent their days working in the grand halls below. They grew accustomed to the sounds of the house settling, but they also began to experience things that could not be explained by shifting wood or thermal expansion. Donald Tinney often spoke of the feeling that the house was populated, not just by memories, but by active presences. One of the most famous areas for these early encounters was the grand staircase. Visitors and family members alike reported the sensation of being followed up the stairs by an invisible entity, or catching a glimpse of a figure in their peripheral vision that would vanish when they turned to look. The Tinneys, far from being frightened, seemed to welcome these occurrences as proof that their work was being noticed. They viewed themselves as the new stewards of a spiritual legacy. As they opened the doors to the public for tour to help fund the massive restoration costs, the reports of hauntings moved from family anecdotes to public record. People who had no prior knowledge of the house's history would come out of a tour shaken, describing identical experiences in specific rooms. The Gothic ballroom, which Oliver Belmont had filled with armor, remained a central hub for this activity. The Tinneys had added even more armor and heavy weaponry to the display, and guests frequently reported hearing the metallic clinking of mail and the sound of heavy boots on the wooden floor when no one was there. It was as if the room had become a permanent reenactment of a medieval barracks. One of the more unsettling reports involved the monk figure, a spectral apparition often seen near the library or the small chapel area the Tinneys had created. This figure was described as wearing a dark, heavy robe and moving with a sense of purpose, ignoring anyone who happened to be in the room. Some speculated that this spirit was attached to one of the many pieces of ecclesiastical furniture the Tinneys had acquired, a silent protector of sacred objects that had been moved from their original holy settings into a private home. The family also began to notice that the house had a physical effect on people. In the French salon, a room filled with delicate gold leaf furniture and fine silk, guests would often complain of sudden, crushing headaches, or a feeling of intense anxiety that would vanish the moment they stepped back into the hallway. The Tinneys themselves were not immune to these sensations, but they developed a sort of psychic callosity, learning to coexist with the fluctuating energies of the estate. They were particularly fond of the many mirrors they had installed, some of which were massive floor-to-ceiling pieces that had belonged to European royalty. Mirrors have long been associated in folklore with the trapping of souls or the opening of portals, and at Belcourt, they seem to function as windows into another time. People would report seeing faces looking back at them that were not their own, or seeing the room behind them in the reflection populated by people in historical dress who were not present in the physical space. This period of the 1950s and 60s was a turning point, as the Tinnies transitioned from being restorers to being the keepers of a haunted legend. They were eccentric, often seen around Newport in their own unique style, and they leaned into the castle persona of the home. Donald Tinney, in particular, became the face of the property, his own life becoming inextricably linked with the stones of Belcourt. He grew up within these walls, his world shaped by the Gothic shadows and the stories of his parents. The relationship between the Tinney family and the house was symbiotic. They gave the house its physical glory back, and the house gave them a sense of purpose and a connection to a world beyond the mundane. But as the collection grew and the years passed, some of the energies within the house seemed to turn darker or at least more territorial. There were reports of objects being moved, of heavy doors that had been locked being found wide open in the morning, and of an oppressive feeling in the basement areas where the original stables had been. The basement, which still retained much of the original layout from Oliver Belmont's time, was a place where the modern world felt very far away. The scent of old earth and cold stone dominated, and it was here that many believed the strongest residual energy of the Belmont era remained. Some visitors claimed to hear the phantom sounds of horses whinnying or the stomping of hooves on the ground, a lingering echo of the animals Oliver had loved so dearly. The Tinneys had used part of this space for storage and workshops, and they frequently spoke of the watchers in the basement, unseen entities that seemed to guard the foundations of the house. As we look back on the first decade of the Tinney ownership, it is clear that they were inadvertently creating a paranormal pressure cooker. By combining a house already steeped in the eccentricities and tragedies of the Belmonts with thousands of antique items from all over the world, they were layering history upon history. Each item brought its own baggage, its own history of owners, emotions, and perhaps its own ghosts. Belcourt was no longer just a house in Newport. It was becoming a crossroads for the displaced spirits of the past. The stage was now set for the more specific and terrifying encounters that would define the house in the later part of the 20th century, including the legendary stories of the haunted chairs and the malevolent entities that some claimed were lurking in the shadows of the grand ballroom. The Tinneys had reopened the door to the past, but they were finding that once that door is open, it is very difficult to control what comes through. The house was waking up, and the spirits within were beginning to make their presence known in ways that could no longer be ignored by the skeptical world outside. As the Tinney family solidified their presence within the walls of Belcourt Castle during the 1960s, the mansion began to develop a reputation that transcended its architectural significance and moved into the realm of the truly bizarre. This was the era where the specific legends of haunted furniture began to take center stage, creating a narrative that would draw paranormal investigators and thrill-seekers from across the globe. Among the thousands of artifacts that Harold and Donald Tinney brought into the home, none gained more notoriety than the two chairs located in the ballroom. These were not just any antique seats. They were heavily carved, high-backed wooden chairs that supposedly dated back hundreds of years to a time of deep superstition and dark craftsmanship. According to the lore that Donald Tinney often shared with visitors, these chairs were possessed by spirits that were intensely protective of their space. Guests who dared to sit in them reported a sensation that was far more visceral than a simple chill. Many claimed that as soon as they sat down, they felt a physical force pushing them out, as if an invisible person was already occupying the seat and was deeply offended by the intrusion. Others described a feeling of sudden, overwhelming cold that seemed to radiate from the wood itself, seeping into their bones and causing their heart rates to spike. There are even documented accounts of people feeling a pair of invisible hands pressing against their shoulders or chest, forcing them to stand up in a state of near panic. This wasn't just the imagination of a few sensitive individuals. The reports were so consistent over the years that the Tinneys eventually had to place ropes across the chairs to prevent unsuspecting tourists from having a traumatic experience. The ballroom itself, which had already been established as a site of heavy activity, became a focal point for these kinetic energy shifts. The tinnies observed that the air in the room would often become thick and stagnant, only to be broken by a sudden, sharp gust of wind that would rattle the crystal chandeliers even when all the windows were tightly sealed and the heavy velvet curtains were still. This period also saw the emergence of the legend of the screaming statue. Located in a gallery near the upper residential quarters was a life-sized wooden carving of a monk or a saint, an object that had been salvaged from a monastery in Europe. On certain nights, particularly during the turbulent Atlantic storms that battered the Newport coast, members of the family and staff claimed to hear a low, muffled moaning coming from the direction of the gallery. On a few terrifying occasions, this moan would escalate into a sharp, guttural cry that echoed through the stone corridors. When someone would rush to investigate, they would find the statue exactly as it had been, its wooden eyes staring blankly into the darkness. Yet the air around it would vibrate with a residual energy that left the witnesses trembling. The tinnies began to suspect that the house was acting as a battery, storing the emotional imprints of every object they added to the collection. They weren't just living in a home. They were living in a curated warehouse of human history, much of which was steeped in the grief, passion, and violence of the past. Harold Tinney, ever the craftsman, spent much of his time in the basement workshops, and he often spoke of the unseen companions that watched him work. He would describe the feeling of a hand resting on his shoulder or the sound of his name being whispered in an empty room. Rather than being terrified, Harold seemed to view these entities as a natural part of the environment, a testament to the fact that Belcourt was a place where the veil was exceptionally thin. However, for those not accustomed to such a high level of spiritual activity, the house could be a daunting place. New staff members rarely lasted more than a few months, often citing a feeling of being unwelcome or reporting that their tools and personal belongings would vanish and reappear in impossible locations. The kitchen area, which had been modernized by the tinnies but still sat within the original stone framework, was another hotspot. Heavy copper pots were said to swing on their hooks without a breeze, and the sound of phantom footsteps would often cross the tile floor, stopping just behind whoever was cooking. It was as if the ghosts of the previous eras were curious about the new inhabitants but remained firmly tethered to their own routines. The tinnies also began to notice a pattern regarding the mirrors they had collected. There was one mirror in particular, a massive gold-leafed piece from the Victorian era that seemed to hold a darker secret. Legend has it that if you stared into the mirror for too long under the right lighting conditions, your own face would begin to distort, taking on the features of a much older, more withered individual. Some claimed to see a shadowy figure standing directly behind them in the reflection, a tall man in a dark suit who would disappear the moment they turned around. This figure became known as the man in the mirror, and he was often associated with the original owner, Oliver Belmont, though his description never quite matched the historical photographs of the man. The house was becoming a labyrinth of these specific, localized hauntings. Each room had its own ghost, its own trigger, and its own unique way of interacting with the living. The Gothic architecture, with its sharp arches and deep recesses, provided the perfect backdrop for these stories to grow. As the 1970s approached, the Tinney family began to lean even further into the supernatural reputation of their home. They started hosting candlelight tour and special events that focused specifically on the paranormal history of the castle. This was a bold move in a town like Newport, which prided itself on its polished, high society image. Belcourt was the black sheep of the Bellevue Avenue mansions, a place that embraced the macabre and the mysterious rather than trying to hide it. This transparency only fueled the public's fascination. People from all over the country began to arrive, hoping to catch a glimpse of the lady in white or to feel the cold touch of the ballroom chairs. But with this increased attention came a new kind of energy. Some believed that the constant influx of people, each bringing their own fears and expectations, was feeding the spirits within the house, making them more active and sometimes more aggressive. There were reports of people being scratched by invisible nails or feeling a sudden, sharp pinch while walking through the library. The spirits of Belcourt were no longer just passive observers. They were becoming participants in the daily life of the museum. The Tinneys remained the steadfast guardians of this chaotic spiritual landscape, with Donald Tinney in particular becoming more attuned to the nuances of the house's moods. He could tell when the energy was off, and would often spend hours talking to the empty rooms, trying to soothe whatever restless soul was causing a disturbance. He believed that the ghosts were not malevolent by nature, but were simply frustrated by their inability to communicate with the modern world. This empathy for the unseen inhabitants of Belcourt is what allowed the Tinneys to stay for so long when others would have fled. They saw the spirits as part of the family, as much a part of the house as the stones and the stained glass. Yet the question remained, what was the ultimate goal of these entities? Were they trapped by the objects they once owned, or were they drawn to Belcourt because of the unique energy of the land itself? Some local historians pointed out that the estate sat near ancient geological fault lines, and that the high quartz content in the Rhode Island soil might be acting as a natural conductor for spiritual energy. Whatever the cause, Belcourt Castle had become a lighthouse for the dead, a place where the past refused to stay silent, and the objects of the previous centuries carried the voices of those who had long since passed away. As we prepare to move into the later decades of the 20th century, the stories only get stranger and the encounters more frequent, leading toward a series of events that would eventually bring the world's most famous paranormal investigators to the gates of Newport's most haunted house. As the calendar turned toward the 1980s, the atmosphere within Belcourt Castle seemed to reach a boiling point of supernatural activity, and the Tinney family found themselves living in a house that was no longer just haunted, but actively communicative. By this time, the collection of antiques had reached such a staggering volume that every square inch of the mansion was occupied by an item with a past, and the sheer density of these objects seemed to create a psychic static that was almost audible to those sensitive to such things. It was during this period that the legend of the monk in the chapel became a centerpiece of the castle's lore. While the Tinneys were not a traditionally religious family in the dogmatic sense, they had a profound respect for ecclesiastical art and had constructed a small, private chapel within the mansion to house their collection of 15th and 16th century religious icons. Among these was a stunning, life-sized carving of a monk that had been salvaged from a monastery that had burned down in Europe centuries prior. Visitors began to report that as they walked past the chapel, the statue appeared to be breathing, or that its wooden eyes would follow them with a gaze that felt piercing and judgmental. On several occasions, tour guides found the chapel doors locked from the inside, even though there was no one in the room and no key existed for that specific lock. When they finally managed to gain entry, the scent of fresh incense would be hanging in the air, despite no one having lit a candle or burned incense in the house for years. This persistent manifestation of the spiritual world was beginning to take a physical toll on the environment. The Tinneys noticed that certain rooms would remain perpetually cold, regardless of how high they turned the heating system or how many fires were roaring in the massive limestone hearths. This cold was not just a drought. It was a localized, bone-chilling drop in temperature that would often precede a visual apparition. It was around this time that the Lady in White became a more frequent visitor to the upper residential wings. Unlike the more territorial spirits of the ballroom, she was described as a melancholic figure, often seen standing at the end of long corridors or drifting through the library. Witnesses described her as wearing a flowing, Victorian-style gown that seemed to emit a soft, internal glow. She never spoke, but her presence was often accompanied by the faint smell of crushed lilacs, a scent that Alva Vanderbilt was known to favor during her time at the estate. Some believe this spirit was indeed Alva, perhaps tethered to the house by her unresolved ambitions or her complicated feelings toward the man who had built it. However, others suggested that the lady in white was a much older spirit, perhaps a bride who had never made it to her wedding, whose energy had been drawn to the castle by the many wedding-related artifacts and bridal finery that the Tinneys had added to their museum. The interaction between the living and the dead became so commonplace that the Tinneys began to develop their own rituals for managing the spirits. Donald Tinney was known to walk through the house at night, speaking out loud to the shadows, acknowledging their presence and asking for peace within the walls. He believed that the ghosts were essentially archival in nature, that they were memories that had gained enough energy to manifest themselves in our reality. But not all the entities were as benign as the lady in white or the silent monk. The basement, the former site of Oliver Belmont's lavish stables, began to develop a much darker reputation. People reported seeing shadow people, dark, shapeless masses that would dart between the mahogany pillars and disappear into the walls. These figures were often accompanied by a sense of profound dread and the sound of heavy breathing just behind the listener's ear. Some paranormal researchers who visited the house suggested that these were not human spirits at all, but rather elementals, ancient energies that were drawn to the site because of the unique geological properties of the Newport coastline. The house was essentially a lightning rod, and the basement was where the most primitive energies were grounded. As the 1980s progressed, the fame of Belcourt Castle as a haunted location began to attract a new wave of attention from the burgeoning field of paranormal investigation. Groups would arrive with early electromagnetic field meters and tape recorders, hoping to capture proof of what the Tinneys already knew to be true. One of the most famous incidents involved a recording made in the Grand Library, where investigators left a voice-activated recorder running overnight in a locked room. When they played the tape back the next morning, they didn't just hear the creaking of the house. They heard a clear, authoritative male voice speaking in a language that sounded like archaic French, followed by the distinct sound of a horse's whinny and the clatter of hooves on a stone floor. This recording sent shockwaves through the local community and solidified Belcourt's status as the preeminent haunted house in Rhode Island. Yet, for the Tinney family, this was simply their daily life. They were the curators of a living history, and they took their responsibility seriously. Ruth Tinney, in particular, was said to have a very strong connection to the house, often sensing when a new spirit had arrived with a recently purchased antique. She could walk into a room and tell immediately if the vibe had shifted, and she was often the one who would perform small, private cleansings of the air to keep the more aggressive energies at bay. The 1980s was also a decade of physical transformation for the house, as the Tinneys continued to add more elaborate architectural details, further blurring the line between the original Belmont structure and their own vision of a medieval castle. They added secret passages, hidden rooms, and even more stained glass, creating a physical environment that was as confusing and labyrinthine as the spiritual one. This complexity only served to give the entities more places to hide and more ways to surprise the unwary visitor. By the end of the decade, the house had become a character in its own right, a brooding, magnificent, and terrifying entity that seemed to breathe along with its inhabitants. The 1990s were looming, a decade that would bring even more intense public scrutiny and a series of events that would test the Tinneys' resolve to stay in the home they had worked so hard to save. The story of Belcourt was moving away from simple ghost stories and toward something much more profound, a study in how the past can truly haunt the present, and how a house can become a prison for both the living and the dead. As we look toward the next chapter, we will see how the arrival of a new millennium brought a fresh wave of challenges, and how the legendary hauntings of Belcourt Castle began to transition from private family experiences into a global phenomenon that would eventually lead to the mansion's ultimate change in ownership. The spirits, however, remained as constant as the stone walls themselves, waiting in the shadows for the next generation to acknowledge their existence. As the final decade of the 20th century dawned upon Newport, The spiritual atmosphere at Belcourt Castle seemed to shift from a series of isolated incidents into a continuous waking dream where the boundaries of time were increasingly porous. The 1990s brought a surge of mainstream interest in the unexplained, and Belcourt stood as the undisputed capital of this movement in New England. By this point, Donald Tinney had become the patriarch of the estate, and his connection to the house had reached a level of intimacy that many found both fascinating and unnerving. He often spoke of the castle not as a building he owned, but as a sovereign entity that allowed him to reside within its walls. The hauntings were no longer merely sights and sounds. They had become interactive. This was the era when the Belcourt energy began to be described by visitors as a physical weight that hit you the moment you crossed the threshold. It was a dense, vibrating sensation, similar to the hum of a high-voltage power line, which some attributed to the massive amount of gold leaf, silver, and iron scattered throughout the rooms. One of the most significant developments during this period involved the Gothic ballroom's deepening mystery. Beyond the haunted chairs, witnesses began to report the phenomenon of phantom crowds. On quiet evenings, when the house was closed to the public and only a few family members remained, the sound of a full, bustling party would erupt from the empty ballroom. This wasn't the muffled sound of a distant radio, but the crystal-clear clinking of glasses, the rustle of silk gowns, and the low roar of polite conversation in multiple languages. When the heavy doors were thrown open, the sound would vanish instantly, leaving only the moonlight reflecting off the cold suits of armor. It was as if the house was replaying its Gilded Age glory days on a loop, a residual haunting so powerful it could manifest an entire social season in the silence of the night. This decade also saw a rise in reports involving the Armor Room, a space dedicated to the military history Oliver Belmont so adored. It was here that a particular helmet, a heavy iron piece from the 16th century, gained a sinister reputation. Several cleaners and tour guides claimed that if they moved the helmet to dust the stand, they would be met with a blast of icy air and a sensation of profound anger. One caretaker famously quit on the spot after claiming that while she was working, the visor of the helmet slammed shut with such force it nearly caught her fingers, followed by a voice that rasped a single, unintelligible word into the stillness. The Tinneys, ever the protectors of their collection, often had to intervene, speaking to the objects as one might calm a high-strung animal. They believed that these artifacts were not just possessed by human spirits, but that the objects themselves had developed a form of consciousness after centuries of being witness to human drama. The library, too, became a site of increased intellectual haunting. Donald Tinney reported that books would often be found lying open on the central table, always turned to passages involving the occult, medieval history, or the genealogy of the Belmont family. It was as if a silent scholar was working through the nights, trying to piece together the history of the house from the inside out. This period of the 90s also saw the arrival of more sophisticated paranormal research teams, who brought with them thermal imaging cameras and early digital voice recorders. The results were staggering. In the French Salon, where the crushing feeling was most prevalent, thermal cameras recorded distinct human-shaped cold spots that moved with purpose across the room, even when the ambient temperature was a steady 70 degrees. These entities appeared to be interacting with the furniture, sitting on the sofas and standing by the windows as if looking out at a Newport that no longer existed. The psychological impact on those who lived in the house was profound. The Tinneys were a tight-knit unit, their lives revolving entirely around the maintenance and defense of Belcourt. They had created a world within a world, a place where the rules of the modern era didn't quite apply. However, the outside world was changing. Newport was becoming more commercialized, and the astronomical costs of keeping a 60-room limestone castle from crumbling were becoming a constant pressure. The salt air of the Atlantic was a relentless enemy, eating away at the masonry and the delicate fabrics. Every dollar earned from the tour went back into the house, but it was a battle of attrition. Some observers began to wonder if the spirits themselves were contributing to the house's decay, or perhaps trying to prevent its modernization. There were stories of contractors who came to perform electrical upgrades only to have their ladders knocked over by invisible hands or their tools go missing for days, only to reappear in the center of the ballroom floor. It seemed the house wanted to remain in its twilight state, suspended between 1894 and 1954. The legends of the monk also took a more visible tone during this time. No longer just a shadow in the corner of the eye, the robed figure was seen by entire tour groups, standing at the top of the grand staircase and looking down with a somber expression before fading into the wood paneling. This particular spirit seemed to be a guardian of sorts, and many visitors reported that despite his imposing appearance, his presence brought a sense of peace rather than fear. This was in stark contrast to the energy in the basement, which continued to darken. The shadow people of the former stables were becoming more bold, occasionally appearing even during the daylight hours to those who wandered too far from the tour path. The air in the lower levels felt thick, almost like walking through water, and the smell of ozone and old leather was omnipresent. By the mid-90s, Belcourt had reached a status of cult-like fame. It was the subject of numerous television specials and books, each one adding to the layers of myth. Yet for all the public exposure, the house kept its deepest secrets close. The tinnies remained the only true confidants of the mansion, the only ones who knew which floorboards to avoid and which spirits required a respectful nod of the head. As the decade drew to a close and the world braced for the turn of the millennium, a sense of foreboding began to settle over the estate. There was a feeling that an era was ending, not just for the world at large, but for the Tinny family stewardship of Belcourt. The spirits seemed more restless than ever, their manifestations more frequent and more physical, as if they knew that the stability of the last 50 years was about to be challenged. The story of Belcourt Castle was entering its most volatile phase, where the weight of the past would finally collide with the realities of the 21st century in a way that would change the mansion forever. The objects were still there, the armor still stood guard, and the chairs still waited for the unwary, but the heart of the house was preparing for a transition that would test the very foundations of the Belmont legacy. As the year 2000 arrived, bringing with it a global sense of nervous anticipation, the energy within Belcourt Castle seemed to reach a state of permanent resonance, as if the mansion itself were vibrating at a frequency separate from the rest of Newport. The turn of the century did not usher in a modern era for the estate, but rather seemed to lock it more firmly into its role as a vessel for the displaced centuries. For Donald Tinney and his mother Ruth, the house was now a living diary, where the entries were written in shadows and echoes. The legendary haunted chairs of the ballroom had by now become so active that even the most hardened skeptics among the tour groups would often refuse to stand near them. It was reported that during several evening events, the chairs were seen to physically slide across the floor by several inches, leaving deep gouges in the polished wood, as if they were being dragged by an invisible occupant who was repositioning themselves for a better view of the room. This physical movement was a significant escalation from the internal sensations of cold or pressure that had defined the previous decades. The ballroom was no longer just a place of residual echoes. It had become a site of kinetic manifestations. This was also the period when the legend of the screaming statue in the gallery took on a more personal dimension for the Tinney family. Donald often recounted how he would find the statue facing a different direction in the morning than it had been the night before, its wooden features appearing to twist into expressions of even greater agony. He believed that the statue was reacting to the changing world outside, acting as a barometer for the psychic pressure building within the castle's walls. The 90-room structure was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, and as the salt air of the Atlantic continued to batter the limestone, the spirits seemed to sense the vulnerability of their sanctuary. Visitors in the early 2000s began to report a new phenomenon, the sound of a woman weeping behind the walls of the French salon. This was distinct from the lady in white silent presence. This was a vocal, heartbreaking sob that would move from room to room, often stopping abruptly when a living person entered the space. Some researchers speculated that this was the spirit of a former servant, perhaps one of the many who had struggled under the demanding rule of Alva Vanderbilt, or perhaps a lingering trace of Alva herself, mourning the faded glory of the Gilded Age. The library also saw a surge in activity, with the shadow scholar becoming more daring. On several occasions, security cameras installed by the tinnies caught flashes of light and the distinct movement of books sliding off the shelves of their own accord. These weren't random falls. The books were often placed in a neat stack on the floor, as if someone were organizing a study session that they never intended to finish. The complexity of the hauntings was mirroring the complexity of the house's physical state. The tinnies had filled the rooms with so many layers of history that the air itself felt heavy with the scent of old paper, cold stone, and the metallic tang of the armor. The armor collection, which remained one of the largest in private hands, was said to be the source of a constant, low-level chatter, a sound like a distant battlefield heard through a thick fog. Many visitors claimed that the eyes of the helmets would track their movements, and some even reported seeing the metal fingers of the gauntlets twitch as they passed by. This sense of being watched by the inanimate was the most pervasive element of the Belcourt experience during this era. It wasn't just about ghosts. It was about the life force that had been infused into the objects by their previous owners and the sheer force of the tinnies' devotion to them. However, as the decade progressed, the financial reality of the 21st century began to cast a longer shadow over the castle than any ghost ever could. The taxes, the insurance, and the constant repairs required to keep a Gilded Age mansion from falling into ruin were becoming an insurmountable burden. The Tinney family, who had given their lives to the preservation of Belcourt, were facing the difficult truth that they might not be able to hold onto the estate forever. This looming transition seemed to agitate the spirits. The reports of poltergeist activity increased, with glassware shattering in the kitchens and the grand chandeliers swaying violently during calm weather. It was as if the house were throwing a tantrum at the prospect of being sold. The basement, the former stables of Oliver Belmont, became a place of almost palpable hostility. The shadow figures seen, they were no longer just fleeting glimpses. They were becoming solid, dark masses that would block the paths of those who ventured into the lower levels. The smell of horse sweat and ozone became so thick it was physically nauseating to some. This was the raw, primal energy of the house's foundation, the place where Oliver's obsession had first taken root. As the 2000s reached their midpoint, the story of Belcourt Castle was a paradox of magnificent decay and vibrant spiritual activity. It remained the most haunted house in a town famous for its ghosts, but it was also a house in transition, its future uncertain and its past more present than ever. The Tinneys continued to welcome the public, sharing the stories of the chairs, the monk, and the lady in white, but there was a growing sense of finality in their voices. They were the last of the old guard, the last family to live in the castle as a home rather than a commercial enterprise. The spirits seemed to recognize this, and their interactions with the family took on a more urgent, almost pleading quality. Donald Tinney spoke of nights where he would be woken by the sound of his name being called from the empty hallways, not in a threatening way, but as if the house were trying to tell him a secret it had been holding since 1894. This period of the mid-2000s was the calm before a major storm, a time when the legends of Belcourt were at their most crystallized, and the world was beginning to realize that the era of the great Newport families was truly coming to an end. The stage was being set for a new owner to step into this haunted legacy, someone who would have to face the spirits on their own terms, and decide the ultimate fate of the 60 rooms and the thousands of silent witnesses that inhabited them. The ghosts of Belcourt were not going anywhere. They were simply waiting for the next act to begin, prepared to challenge anyone who thought they could own a place that had so clearly chosen its own inhabitants. As the first decade of the 21st century deepened, the legend of Belcourt Castle entered a phase of heavy, atmospheric suspense that felt like the tightening of a string about to snap. The financial pressures on the Tinney family had reached a critical mass, and the physical state of the 60-room mansion was becoming a reflection of the restless energy that had built up over a century of eccentric habitation. It was during these years, leading up to the eventual sale of the property, that the most documented and harrowing accounts of the haunted chairs in the Gothic ballroom emerged. For decades they had been a curiosity, but now they seemed to manifest a more assertive, almost desperate personality. Tourists and paranormal researchers alike began to capture more than just feelings. They captured anomalies that defied the growing sophistication of digital photography. Orbs of light, described not as dust particles but as pulsating, self-illuminated spheres, were frequently photographed hovering directly above the seats of the chairs. Some visitors reported that the air around the chairs would shimmer like a heat mirage, even in the dead of winter when the ballroom was as cold as a tomb. This was also the time when the monk entity began to venture further from the chapel. No longer content to remain in the shadows of the religious icons, the robed figure was seen by multiple witnesses in the library and the grand hallway simultaneously, leading some to believe that there wasn't just one monk, but a brotherhood of spirits tied to the various pieces of monastic furniture the Tinneys had collected. The library, which served as the intellectual heart of the home, became a site of profound auditory phenomena. Beyond the sound of sliding books, people began to hear the scratch of a quill on parchment and the low, rhythmic chanting of Latin prayers. When investigators attempted to record these sounds, they often found their equipment inexplicably drained of power within minutes of entering the room. Batteries that had been fully charged would plummet to zero, only to regain their charge once they were moved outside the castle walls. This energy siphoning became a hallmark of the Belcourt experience, suggesting that the entities within required a massive amount of electrical or spiritual fuel to manifest in our physical reality. The relationship between Donald Tinney and the house reached its most poignant and complex stage during this period. He was not just the owner. He was the primary witness to the house's decline and its spiritual crescendo. He spoke of the house as if it were a wounded animal, protective yet suffering. He once described a night in the mid-2000s when he was walking through the house with a flashlight during a power outage, and saw the entire ballroom populated not by the usual phantom crowd, but by a silent assembly of every person who had ever lived or worked in the house, all standing perfectly still and looking toward the grand entrance as if waiting for a signal. This vision, whether a trick of the mind or a true psychic bleed-through, underscored the idea that Belcourt was a reservoir of time where nothing was ever truly lost. The basement stables, however, remained the most terrifying sector of the estate. The shadow figures there had grown more distinct, sometimes appearing as tall, hooded silhouettes that would stand at the end of the mahogany stalls, blocking the path of anyone trying to reach the storage areas. The smell of horses, which had been a faint echo for decades, became so pungent at times that visitors would have to flee the area, gasping for fresh air. It was as if the ground floor was reclaiming its original purpose as a place for beasts, rejecting the human presence that had tried to domesticate it. The legend of the man in the mirror also saw a resurgence, with more frequent reports of a tall, dark-clad figure standing in the reflection of the Victorian mirrors, his hand resting on the shoulder of whoever was looking in. This figure never appeared in the physical room, only in the silvered glass, a haunting that suggested a parallel reality existing just behind the surface of our own. As rumors of the house's potential sale began to circulate through Newport, the spirits seemed to go into a frenzy of activity. Objects that had remained stationary for 50 years were found in different rooms. Paintings would be found hanging upside down, and the heavy velvet curtains in the French salon were often found tied in intricate, impossible knots. It was a chaotic, poltergeist-driven period that tested the Tinney family's resolve to its absolute limit. They were living in a whirlwind of history and hauntings, a life that was both magnificent and exhausting. The public's fascination only grew, and Belcourt became a pilgrimage site for those seeking a genuine encounter with the unknown. Yet, beneath the thrill of the ghost stories lay a deeper, more tragic narrative of a family trying to hold on to a dream that was slipping away. The 17-part history of this castle is not just a list of ghosts. It is a story of how a house can consume those who love it. As we move closer to the 2012 sale of the estate to Caroline Raphaelian, the founder of Alex and Ani, the energy of the house would undergo yet another massive shift. The transition from the tinny era to the modern era of restoration would bring about a cleansing of the house that many believed would silence the ghosts forever. But as we will see, the spirits of Belcourt were not so easily evicted. The objects might be moved, the walls might be painted, and the stables might be repurposed, but the foundation of the house was built on the obsessions of the past, and those obsessions have a way of lingering long after the keys have changed hands. The stage was set for a clash between modern corporate restoration and ancient, entrenched hauntings, a battle for the soul of Rhode Island's most enigmatic castle. The voices in the walls were not quieted by the prospect of change. They were merely waiting to see if the new owner would be a friend or a foe to the silent witnesses who had called Belcourt home for over a century. As the first decade of the 21st century began to close, the air within Belcourt Castle grew increasingly heavy with a sense of impending transition. The Tinney family, who had served as the self-appointed guardians of this limestone labyrinth for over 50 years, were finding that the weight of the past was becoming physically and financially unsustainable. In the year 2012, a seismic shift occurred in the history of the estate when it was purchased by Caroline Raphaelian, the founder of the jewelry empire Alex and Ani. This transition marked a pivotal moment where the raw, cluttered mysticism of the Tinney era met the focused, high-energy restoration goals of a new visionary. Raphaelian did not see a crumbling, haunted mansion. She saw a sacred space that needed to be cleansed, honored, and restored to its original architectural brilliance. However, the process of emptying the house of its thousands of artifacts was like performing surgery on a living organism. As the heavy German sideboards, the suits of armor, and the ecclesiastical relics were carefully packed and moved, the energy of the house seemed to go into a state of shock. Many of the paranormal investigators who had frequented the house during the late Tinney years claimed that the spirits were in a state of upheaval. The phantom crowd in the ballroom was said to have grown silent, replaced by a tense, waiting atmosphere. When the iconic haunted chairs were moved from their long-standing positions, witnesses reported that the temperature in the ballroom dropped so sharply that their breath was visible in the air, despite it being a mild Newport morning. It was as if the house were holding its breath, unsure of its fate under new leadership. Raphaelian's approach was one of energetic clearing. She brought in experts to perform ceremonies intended to release the stagnant, heavy energies that had accumulated over a century. This was a direct contrast to the Tinney philosophy, which had been to live alongside and even nourish the spirits. During the early stages of this massive renovation, the construction crews began to experience the same phenomena that had plagued caretakers for generations. Tools would disappear from locked rooms only to be found neatly lined up in the center of the stables. The sound of heavy footsteps on the second floor became a constant accompaniment to the sound of hammers and saws. It seemed that while the physical objects were leaving, the imprints they had left behind remained etched into the stone and wood of the building. The renovation revealed hidden aspects of the house that had been obscured for decades. Layers of paint were stripped away to reveal original finishes, and structural repairs uncovered secret voids within the walls that Oliver Belmont had designed for ventilation or perhaps for more clandestine purposes. As the clutter of the museum era was removed, the original architectural intent of Richard Morris Hunt began to breathe again. The house started to look less like a haunted curiosity shop and more like the French Renaissance masterpiece it was always meant to be. Yet, the spirits of the Belmont era seemed to find this return to form particularly interesting. The lady in white was seen with more frequency in the library, her presence no longer mourning but seemingly observant of the changes. Some believed that the restoration was actually feeding the older spirits, giving them back the stage they had originally occupied before the tinny collection had overwhelmed the space. The library, in particular, remained a hotspot for activity. Even with the shelves emptied of their leather-bound volumes, the scent of old paper and the sound of phantom page-turning persisted. One of the most striking reports from this transitional period involved a modern security system that was being installed. The cameras, high definition and equipped with infrared sensors, began to trigger at all hours of the night in the empty Gothic ballroom. When the footage was reviewed, there were no human intruders, but the sensors picked up clear, localized heat signatures that moved with a graceful, rhythmic motion across the floor, as if a ghostly couple were practicing a waltz in the middle of a construction zone. This suggested that the residual hauntings were not just static loops, but were capable of adapting to the new environment. The basement, the former stables of Oliver Belmont, underwent perhaps the most dramatic physical change. The stalls were cleaned, the mahogany was polished to a mirror finish, and the heavy, oppressive atmosphere that had defined the area for years began to lift, replaced by a cleaner, more vibrant energy. However, the shadow figures did not vanish entirely. They retreated into the deepest corners of the foundation, becoming silent watchers of the transformation. As the restoration progressed, it became clear that Caroline Raphaelian was not just repairing a building, she was attempting to recalibrate its soul. She removed the castle from the name, returning it simply to Belcourt of Newport, signaling a return to the Belmont roots. This act of naming was powerful, and many local historians felt it was a gesture of respect that the spirits of Oliver and Alva would have appreciated. But a house with a history as dense as Belcourt's does not give up its secrets easily. The more the walls were opened, the more the house seemed to reveal its multifaceted nature. There were reports of strange acoustic anomalies where a conversation held in the kitchen could be heard perfectly in the master bedroom, a design quirk that some attributed to Hunt's genius and others to more supernatural intent. By the mid-2010s, Belcourt was a place of immense beauty and renewed vigor, yet the stories of the chairs and the monks remained a part of its identity. The objects were gone, but the memories of the objects felt permanent. The new era of Belcourt was one of luxury and light, but the shadows remained an integral part of the architecture. The question for the future was whether this new, polished version of the estate would be a place where the living and the dead could truly find a peaceful coexistence, or if the ancient energies of the land and the stones would eventually reassert themselves over the modern improvements. As we continue to trace the journey of this remarkable property, we see that the haunting of Belcourt is not a fixed state, but a living, evolving narrative that changes with every new owner and every new coat of paint. The spirits are part of the very molecular structure of the place, a lingering echo of a gilded age that refuses to be silenced by the passage of time or the arrival of the 21st century. The transformation under Raphaelian was a high-stakes gamble with the unseen world, a test of whether intention and care could heal the fractures of a century-old haunting. The decade following the change in ownership served as a profound period of energetic realignment for the estate now known as Belcourt of Newport. Under Caroline Raphaelian's direction, the transformation was not merely aesthetic, but almost surgical in its intent to strip away the heavy, suffocating layers of the tinny era, while respecting the original architectural bones of the Belmont legacy. As the massive restoration began, the house seemed to react to the presence of modern technology and the absence of its long-time curiosities. When the thousands of antique relics were finally cleared out, it was as if the mansion itself took a deep, echoing breath. However, for those working on the site, this breath felt more like a chilling draught. Construction crews reported that the building felt more alive when it was empty than when it was full. Without the distraction of the tinny collection, the residual energy of the 1890s seemed to surge back into the foreground. Workers frequently experienced the sensation of being watched from the high mezzanine of the Gothic ballroom, and the sound of phantom voices echoed through the ventilation shafts with a clarity that had not been heard in decades. This period of the mid-20 teens saw a shift in how the hauntings manifested. No longer anchored to specific objects like the haunted chairs or the screaming statue, the energy became more atmospheric and architectural. One of the most persistent reports during the renovation involved the grand staircase, where the scent of expensive cigar smoke, a known habit of Oliver Belmont, would suddenly materialize in the air, lingering for moments before being whisked away by the salt breeze. It was during this time that Raphaelian's commitment to holistic restoration came into play. She believed that the house was a conscious entity that had been traumatized by its own history and the chaotic accumulation of spirits brought in by the tinnies. She utilized copper, crystals, and specific architectural alignments to help ground the estate, seeking to transform it from a place of dread into a place of light. This process, however, was not without its friction. The spirits of the castle did not always seem to want to be grounded. During the installation of new electrical systems, engineers were baffled by constant, inexplicable power surges that only occurred in the former chapel area. Even with state-of-the-art surge protectors, light bulbs would shatter and equipment would malfunction without warning. Some of the more spiritually inclined observers suggested that the monk entity, which had been so prominent during the 20th century, was still present, perhaps guarding the sacred space that had once been his home. The basement area, where the original stables had been, also remained a site of intense activity. Despite the deep cleaning and the removal of the dark, heavy stalls, the phantom sounds of horses remained. Several security guards reported hearing the unmistakable sound of a heavy horse-drawn carriage pulling into the central courtyard in the middle of the night, only to find the gates locked and the cobblestones empty when they investigated. The 10th part of this 17-part journey marks the halfway point of the transition into the modern age, where the legend of Belcourt began to move away from the haunted museum trope and toward something more akin to a restored ancestral temple. Raphaelian's vision was to open the house for events that celebrated the arts and human connection, but the ghosts seemed to have their own ideas about who should be allowed in the space. On several occasions during private soft-opening events, guests reported seeing a tall, elegant woman in a white gown standing at the edge of the ballroom, looking on with an expression of stoic approval. This lady in white had survived the transition, but her energy had changed. She no longer seemed mournful, but rather like a silent matron of the house, presiding over its rebirth. As the 2020s approached, the story of Belcourt became a fascinating case study in how intention can shape the paranormal. The aggressive poltergeist activity of the late 90s had largely subsided, replaced by a more refined, lingering presence of the Gilded Age. The house felt cleaner, brighter, and more aligned with its original purpose as a monument to excellence, yet the underlying mystery never fully evaporated. The voices in the walls were quieter, but they were not gone. They had merely retreated into the stones themselves, becoming part of the foundation. The library, now restored to its original splendor without the clutter of the tinny era, became a place of profound quietude, though many still claimed that if you sat in silence for long enough, you could hear the faint rustle of silk and the soft murmur of a conversation taking place just out of reach. This phase of the story demonstrates that while you can move the furniture and paint the walls, the history of a place like Belcourt is indelible. It is a narrative written in the very soil of Newport, a place where the barrier between the past and the present is permanently frayed. The spirits of Oliver Belmont, Alva Vanderbilt, and even the Tinney family remain part of the fabric of the building, witnesses to the ongoing evolution of their sanctuary. As we prepare to delve into the more recent investigations and the modern-day encounters that continue to occur within these walls, we must recognize that Belcourt is a living bridge between the 19th and 21st centuries. It remains a place where the light of modern restoration must constantly contend with the shadows of a complicated past. The next chapters of our journey will explore the specific modern-day sightings, and the ways in which the castle's reputation continues to grow in the digital age, proving that even in a world of high-speed internet and global connectivity, some mysteries remain as potent and impenetrable as the limestone walls of a Newport castle. Entering the era of the 2020s, Belcourt of Newport began to project an aura of refined, quiet vigilance that differed sharply from the chaotic theatricality of its past. As the restoration reached its final, most meticulous stages, the mansion emerged as a paradox of modern preservation and ancient energy. The 11th part of our journey explores the phenomenon of the house after the dust of construction had settled, revealing that the spirits had not been evicted by the scrubbing of stones, but had instead been given a more pristine stage upon which to manifest. One of the most compelling aspects of this modern phase was the shift in acoustic activity. While the tinny era was marked by the heavy clatter of phantom armor and the groans of old furniture, the current atmosphere is defined by the whispering gallery effect. Security personnel and late-night staff have reported that the house now acts as a massive conductor for voices that seem to originate from the very air molecules of the rooms. These are not the muffled cries of the past, but clear, conversational snippets that sound as if people are standing just a few feet away. In the grand library, which had been stripped of its crowded bookshelves to reveal the magnificent original wood paneling, witnesses have described hearing the distinct sound of a woman's laughter, light, sophisticated, and entirely out of place in an empty building. Some believe this is a residual imprint of Alva Vanderbilt in her prime, finally comfortable in a house that has been restored to the standards of her social standing. This period also saw a fascinating evolution in the shadow people of the lower levels. With the basement and former stables now brightly lit and elegantly finished, the dark entities that once lurked in the mahogany stalls have become more elusive but more distinct. Instead of shapeless masses, witnesses now describe seeing the quick, darting silhouettes of men in formal 19th century attire moving between the pillows. These figures are often seen out of the corner of the eye, vanishing the moment a direct gaze is applied. It is as if the restoration has forced the ghosts to clean up their own appearance to match the new environment. The legendary haunted chairs, though moved from their original ballroom positions and into private or storage collections, left behind what paranormal researchers call a place memory. Even in the empty space where the chairs once sat for decades, people still report a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature and a feeling of intense physical resistance, as if the air itself has become solid. This suggests that the objects were not just containers for spirits, but anchors that permanently warped the energetic field of the room. As Carolyn Raphaelian integrated more of her own spiritual philosophy into the estate, including the placement of massive gemstones and the use of sacred geometry in the landscaping, the house began to exhibit what some call the Belcourt glow. On certain nights, particularly during the full moon or during intense solar activity, neighbors and passers-by on Bellevue Avenue have reported that the limestone walls of the house seem to emit a faint, bioluminescent shimmer. While skeptics point to the play of streetlights on the salt-crusted stone, those who have spent time inside the gates believe it is the house's way of breathing, a sign that the energetic clearing has been successful in moving the property from a state of trauma to a state of resonance. However, this new light has not entirely banished the darkness. The 11th chapter of Belcourt's story also includes the chilling third-floor mystery. This level, which traditionally housed the servant quarters and remained the least modernized part of the building for a long time, has become a site of intense activity for those tasked with its maintenance. Workers have reported that their names are called out by a voice that sounds identical to their own, a phenomenon known as a mimic. This type of haunting is often considered more advanced and intelligent than simple residual loops, suggesting that there is a consciousness within Belcourt that is learning from its living inhabitants. The mimicry has caused significant unease among the staff, leading to a policy where no one works on the upper floors alone after sunset. Despite the beauty of the silk tapestries and the gleaming chandeliers, the house retains a sense of watchful waiting. It is no longer a place that screams its history at you. It is a place that whispers it, requiring a quiet mind and a sharp ear to perceive. The transition from the 19th century stable to a 20th century museum, and finally to a 21st century sanctuary, has made Belcourt one of the most energetically complex buildings in the United States. Each layer of history is still there, stacked like transparent sheets over the present moment. If you walk through the courtyard today, you might feel the breeze of a passing carriage that hasn't existed for 80 years, or you might catch the scent of a perfume that was discontinued before the Great Depression. This is the true power of Belcourt, its ability to hold onto every second of its existence with a grip that neither time nor restoration can loosen. As we move into the final third of our 17-part history, we will begin to look at the broader implications of Belcourt's haunting on the Newport community and the modern scientific efforts to quantify the Belcourt energy using advanced quantum sensors. The house is no longer just a ghost story. It is a living laboratory for the study of how human emotion and architectural intent can create a permanent mark on the physical world. The spirits of the Belmonts, the Tinneys, and the anonymous staff members who labored in the shadows are all still there, woven into the limestone and the oak, waiting for the next chapter of their long, silent residence to unfold. The restoration may have healed the house's body, but its spirit remains as restless and enigmatic as the day Oliver Belmont first dreamed of a castle for his horses. As we move deeper into the current decade, the 12th part of our exploration into Belcourt of Newport reveals a shift from anecdotal ghost stories to a more profound, almost scientific inquiry into the persistent energy of the estate. While the previous century was defined by the clatter of armor and the visual drama of the Tinney collection, the modern era has seen the house develop into a high-resonance environment where the past seems to vibrate just beneath the surface of the present. One of the most significant modern phenomena is the digital distortion zone. Technology experts and photographers hired to document the new renovations have frequently reported that high-end digital cameras often fail or glitch in specific rooms, particularly in the grand library and the second-floor salon. These aren't just dead batteries. The images themselves often come out with strange vertical banding or digital snow that occurs only within the limestone walls. Some technicians believe this is due to the high mineral content of the stone or the massive amounts of copper and crystal integrated into the house during its recent spiritual realignment. But others suspect the spirits themselves are interfering with the frequency of modern recording devices. The 12th chapter of this 17-part history is also characterized by the rise of sentient sensations, where visitors no longer just see or hear things, but feel a direct, localized physical response to the house's memory. In the restored stables, where the air is now pristine and the mahogany shines with a deep luster, guests often report a sudden, phantom sensation of heat, as if they are standing next to a large, invisible animal. This thermal haunting is one of the most consistent reports of the 2020s, suggesting that the massive energy of 60 living horses, housed there for decades in luxury, has created a permanent heat signature in the foundation of the building. Furthermore, the acoustic anomalies have evolved into something researchers call echo displacement. This occurs when a sound made in one part of the castle is heard clearly in another, but with a significant time delay. A worker might drop a tool in the courtyard, only for the sound of the impact to be heard inside the Gothic ballroom 5 minutes later. It is as if the house is recording the present and playing it back at its own leisure, blurring the linear progression of time. This has led to a sense of temporal vertigo among the staff, who often find themselves questioning if a sound they just heard happened seconds ago or decades prior. The role of Caroline Raphaelian in this period cannot be understated. By treating the house as a living, breathing patient in need of healing, she has seemingly allowed the more aggressive, trapped spirits of the mid-20th century to move on, but in their place, The original, foundational spirits of the Gilded Age have become more prominent. The lady in white, who was once a figure of mourning, is now described as a guardian presence. She is no longer seen drifting through walls in a state of distress. Instead, she is often spotted standing near the new architectural additions, as if inspecting the work for quality. This transition from haunted to hallowed is a recurring theme in the 12th part of our story. The house is being treated with a level of respect it hasn't seen since the death of Oliver Belmont in 1908, and the entities within seem to be reciprocating with a more dignified form of manifestation. However, the mystery of the third floor remains the dark heart of the modern castle. While the lower floors are open and filled with light, the upper reaches, where the servants once lived and worked in the shadows of the great families, still retain a heavy, secretive air. It is here that the mimic phenomenon continues to occur, with staff hearing their own voices whispered back to them from empty rooms. Some paranormal theorists suggest that this is a form of intelligent residual, where the house has learned to imitate its occupants as a way of maintaining a connection between the living and the dead. The 12th part of our journey also touches upon the geological theories surrounding Newport itself. Belcourt sits upon a bed of ancient shale and quartz, and some believe the house acts as a giant crystal, amplifying the psychic energy of everyone who enters. This would explain why the experiences at Belcourt are so much more intense and frequent than at the neighboring mansions of the Breakers or Marble House. Belcourt was built with a different intent, not for show, but for the private obsession of one man, and that singular focus has created a more potent energetic seal. As we look toward the final 5 parts of our series, we must consider the possibility that Belcourt is not just a place where ghosts live, but a place that is itself a ghost, a physical manifestation of a vanished era that refuses to dissolve into the modern world. The restoration has not ended the hauntings. It has merely refined them, turning a chaotic scream into a clear, persistent whisper. The stories of the haunted chairs may have faded into the history books, but the energy that powered them has simply found new ways to interact with the 21st century. We are witnessing the maturation of a haunting, where a house and its spirits have finally found a way to coexist in a state of mutual respect. The ghosts of Belcourt are no longer invaders in a family home. They are the permanent residents of a monument that has finally remembered how to honor them. As we continue, we will explore the global impact of the Belcourt legend and how it has influenced modern ghost hunting culture and the architectural philosophy of living history that is now being applied to other Gilded Age estates. The story of Belcourt is far from over. It is simply entering its most sophisticated phase yet, where the line between the physical and the spiritual is thinner than it has ever been. As we move into the 13th part of this 17-part exploration, the narrative of Belcourt of Newport enters the realm of the collective consciousness, where the private hauntings of a single family home transformed into a global phenomenon that would forever alter the landscape of paranormal research. By the early 2020s, the legend of Belcourt had outgrown the narrow streets of Newport and began to serve as a case study for the theory of stone tape recording, the idea that certain minerals and structural designs can physically absorb and replay human emotions like a magnetic tape. This period is defined by the intersection of ancient mysticism and modern physics, as researchers began to look at the sheer volume of limestone and granite used in the construction of Oliver Belmont's dream. One of the most fascinating developments in this chapter is the discovery of the basement resonance. Even after the extensive and beautiful cleaning of the former stables, a group of acoustic engineers discovered that the lower level of the house possesses a natural frequency that sits right at the edge of human hearing, a low-frequency hum that can induce feelings of awe, anxiety, or the sensation of being watched. This scientific find provided a bridge between the skeptics and the believers. While the engineers saw a fluke of architecture and geology, the spiritual community saw a deliberate design by Richard Morris Hunt and Oliver Belmont, to create a temple that vibrated with the energy of the earth itself. This 13th chapter also delves into the memory of objects that persisted even after the tinny collection was largely dispersed. It was discovered that visitors who had never seen the house during its museum phase would frequently describe seeing specific items, like a heavy, ornate mirror or a specific suit of armor, in rooms that were now entirely empty. These phantom objects suggest that the presence of the antiques for over 50 years had etched a permanent holographic imprint into the air of the castle. The ballroom, now a pristine space of light and polished wood, still occasionally plays host to the scent of the horses from the floor below, an olfactory haunting that defies the modern ventilation systems. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this period is the watcher in the courtyard. As the exterior of the house was restored to its original 1894 appearance, neighbors began to report a figure standing on the roofline near the massive chimneys, a silhouette of a man in a long coat who appeared to be surveying the surrounding Newport estates with a sense of possessive pride. This figure, believed by many to be the spirit of Oliver Belmont himself, only appears when the moon is in a specific alignment with the castle's towers, suggesting that the house serves as a celestial clock, marking the passage of time in ways the living are only beginning to understand. The transition of Belcourt into a space for high-end events and cultural gatherings also brought a new type of witness, the unsuspecting guest. Unlike the ghost hunters of the past, these visitors come for the beauty of the architecture, only to be confronted by the reality of the house's residents. There are stories from recent years of catering staff hearing their names whispered in the service elevators, or wedding guests seeing a reflection of a 19th-century footman standing behind them in the ballroom mirrors. The 13th part of our story highlights that the cleansing of the house did not delete the spirits, but rather clarified them. The static was gone, but the signal remained. Carolyn Rafaelian's work has essentially tuned the radio of the house to a clearer station, allowing the original occupants to manifest with a dignity that was often lost during the cluttered museum years. This period also saw a rise in the study of the Belcourt ley lines, with researchers suggesting that the castle sits at the intersection of several natural energy paths that run through the Rhode Island coast. This would explain why the activity at Belcourt is so much more intelligent and interactive than at other haunted locations. The house isn't just a container for ghosts. It is a battery that is constantly being recharged by the environment. As we look toward the final stages of our journey, we must grapple with the idea that Belcourt of Newport is a place where the past has won the battle against oblivion. It is a structure that has successfully resisted the modern world's attempt to turn it into a mere historical curiosity. The spirits within are not remnants of a dead era. They are active participants in a continuous present. The library, the ballroom, and the stables remain as much theirs as they are the current owners. This chapter of the history reminds us that we are only ever guests in the spaces we build, and that some houses are built with enough passion and obsession to ensure that they never truly become empty. The legacy of the Belmonts and the Tinneys is now a permanent part of the Newport skyline, a limestone monument to the idea that love, obsession, and even grief can be stronger than the passage of a century. As the sun sets over the Atlantic and the shadows stretch across the Belcourt courtyard, the voices of the past begin their nightly conversation once again, proving that in this particular corner of the world, the story is never truly finished. It is only waiting for the next person brave enough to listen to the stones. As the third decade of the 21st century marches on, the 14th part of our 17-part investigation into Belcourt of Newport centers on the fascinating evolution of the living monument, and how the house has begun to interact with the modern world's digital footprint. In an era where every person carries a high-definition camera and a direct line to global social media, the hauntings of Belcourt have transitioned from private family anecdotes into a form of crowdsourced paranormal data. This chapter explores the phenomenon of the digital ghost, where visitors capturing mundane selfies or architectural shots find their images populated by anomalies that were invisible to the naked eye. In the Grand Hall, where the light now pours through meticulously restored stained glass, modern smartphones frequently struggle to find a focus point, their internal sensors jumping erratically as if tracking a fast-moving object in an empty room. These digital glitches have become so common that technical specialists have visited the site to rule out magnetic interference from the coastline or the house's internal wiring. Their findings were inconclusive, often noting that the interference seemed to follow the visitors rather than the infrastructure. This period is also defined by the renovation echoes, a phenomenon where the house seems to be projecting memories of its various states of construction. Workers and evening guests have reported seeing glimpses of the 1950s-era Tinny Museum superimposed over the modern, sleek restoration. For a fleeting second, a visitor might see a heavy, dusty tapestry hanging where there is now only a clean limestone wall, or smell the distinct scent of the wood polish Harold Tinny used 60 years ago. This suggests that Belcourt has reached a state of temporal saturation, where the layers of its history are so thick that they are beginning to bleed into one another. The 14th part of our story also focuses on the servant staircase, a narrow, winding passage that remained largely untouched during the grandest phases of the recent restoration. While the public rooms are filled with the light of a new era, this staircase remains a cold, dark artery of the house. It is here that the most visceral modern encounters take place. Staff members have reported the feeling of being brushed past by someone in a hurry, accompanied by the rustle of a heavy apron or the clink of a silver tray. These are the forgotten spirits of Newport, the men and women who kept the gears of the Gilded Age turning while remaining invisible to the masters of the house. In the 2020s, these invisible workers are making themselves known, reclaiming their space in the narrative of Belcourt. The library, too, has entered a new phase of activity. Now that the physical books have been largely replaced by a curated selection of historical volumes, the shadow scholar has become more vocal. Late at night, security has recorded the sound of a chair being pulled out across the floor, and the distinct, rhythmic tapping of fingers on a wooden table, as if someone is impatiently waiting for a piece of information to be revealed. This intelligent interaction suggests that the spirits are not just recordings, but entities with a lingering sense of purpose. Furthermore, the 14th chapter looks at the influence of the Belcourt crystals. Caroline Raphaelian's integration of large quartz and amethyst clusters into the home's design has created what some sensitive visitors describe as an energy amplifier. Rather than dampening the spirits, these stones seem to have provided them with a cleaner, more sustainable power source. The atmosphere in the ballroom during a full moon is described as electrically charged, with the air vibrating at a frequency that can be felt in the chest. This has turned Belcourt into a primary destination for those studying the intersection of geology and the paranormal. The house is no longer just a site of interest for ghost hunters. It is a focal point for quantum researchers interested in the nature of consciousness and its ability to leave a permanent mark on the physical environment. As we move closer to the final stages of our series, the story of Belcourt is no longer just about who lived there or what was built there. It is about the very nature of reality in a place where the past refuses to fade. The 14th part of our history serves as a reminder that, as we advance technologically, our ability to detect the ancient and the unexplained only grows more refined. The ghosts of Oliver Belmont, the Tinnies, and the anonymous servants are not retreating into the darkness. They are standing in the light of the 21st century, waiting to be acknowledged by a world that is finally developing the tools to see them. The house stands as a silent sentinel on the Rhode Island coast, a limestone fortress that has successfully bridged 3 centuries of human drama, obsession, and mystery. The conversation between the stones and the spirits continues, and as we look toward the final 3 parts of our journey, we will see how the legend of Belcourt is being preserved for future generations, ensuring that the voices in the walls will never truly be silenced. The stage is now set for the ultimate realization of what Belcourt has become, a place where time is not a line, but a circle, and where every inhabitant, living or dead, is a permanent part of the architecture. As we approach the zenith of our 17-part odyssey through the corridors of Belcourt of Newport, the 15th chapter finds the estate transitioning from a site of localized haunting into a global archetype for the intersection of luxury, heritage, and the high-vibration paranormal. In the mid-2020s, the house has achieved a state of harmonic equilibrium, a term coined by those who have witnessed the results of Caroline Raphaelian's intensive energetic restoration. This part of the story examines the fascinating emergence of the Belcourt frequency, a phenomenon where the very stones of the castle seem to pulse with a low-level electromagnetic charge that modern sensors can finally detect. For researchers, this represents the holy grail of haunting studies, a physical environment that maintains a constant, measurable interaction with an unseen dimension. The 15th part of our journey also focuses on the echoes of the Gilded Age, where the restoration of the mansion's original French and Gothic aesthetics has seemingly acted as a homing beacon for the spirits of the late 19th century. No longer obscured by the dense, eclectic collection of the 10 years, the spirits of the Belmont era have reclaimed their original stages. In the Grand Salon, witnesses have reported seeing the air itself shimmer into the shape of a grand dinner party, complete with the clink of fine crystal and the distant, melodic strains of a string quartet that hasn't played in Newport for over 100 years. This is not the frightening, heavy activity of a traditional ghost story, but a sophisticated, elegant replaying of history that suggests Belcourt has become a temporal oasis. The 15th chapter also uncovers the mystery of the basement guardians. As the lower levels were transformed into clean, vibrant spaces, the shadow figures of the past evolved into something more akin to sentinels. Security personnel now describe these entities as the Watchers, figures who do not interfere with the modern world but seem to stand at the thresholds of the house, ensuring that the newfound balance is maintained. There is a sense that the house has finally reached a truce with its own history. The library, now a space of profound intellectual clarity, continues to be the site of the most intelligent manifestations. Visitors have reported that the temperature in the room fluctuates not based on the weather, but based on the topic of conversation being held within its walls. If one discusses the naval history of the Belmont family or the architectural theories of Richard Morris Hunt, the room reportedly grows warm and inviting, as if the house itself is leaning in to listen. This period also highlights the influence of the Belcourt geodes, the massive crystal clusters placed throughout the home. These are no longer seen as mere decorations, but as the power cells of the estate's spiritual life. Sensitive visitors claim that the crystals act as filters, catching the residual grief of the past and transmuting it into a clean, resonant energy that empowers the living rather than draining them. This has made Belcourt a primary site for the study of architectural alchemy, where the physical materials of a building are used to intentionally shape the psychological and spiritual experience of those inside. As we look toward the final 2 parts of our history, the 15th chapter serves as a testament to the idea that a house can be healed. The hauntings of Belcourt are no longer a source of dread, but a source of wonder. The legendary chairs, the monk, and the screaming statue have all retreated into the deep memory of the stones, replaced by a refined, watchful presence that honors the past while embracing the future. The house stands as a lighthouse on the Rhode Island coast, not just for ships, but for the human spirit, proving that even the darkest and most complicated legacies can be transformed into something of immense beauty and light. The story of Belcourt is now one of triumph, a narrative where the voices in the walls are no longer crying for attention, but are participating in a quiet, eternal conversation with the 21st century. The stage is set for the ultimate conclusion of our series, where we will look at the final legacy of Belcourt and its place in the enduring mythos of American history. The house is ready, The spirits are at peace, and the stones are silent witnesses to a rebirth that once seemed impossible. As we arrive at the 16th and penultimate chapter of our journey through the stones and spirits of Belcourt, we find the estate standing at a rare crossroads of historical preservation and modern energetic theory. In this late stage of the 2020s, the house has moved beyond its reputation as a place of mere haunting to become a global symbol of the persistent past. This part of our story focuses on the concept of the mansion as a living, breathing archive where the digital and the spiritual have finally merged. One of the most remarkable developments in recent years is the phenomenon of the silver screen echoes. High-definition video crews tasked with filming the restored interiors have frequently captured what appear to be visual artifacts from the early 20th century. Fate, translucent silhouettes of people moving in a frame rate that doesn't match the modern equipment. These are not just glitches. They are historical layers manifesting through the lens of technology that is now sensitive enough to pick up the noise of the past. The 16th part of our history also examines the final integration of the Tinney and Belmont legacies. For decades, these two eras seem to be in conflict, but the modern restoration has found a way to honor both. In the upper galleries, where the light is now calibrated to mimic the gaslit glow of the 1890s, visitors report a profound sense of time slipping, where the boundary between 1894, 1954, and the present day becomes entirely porous. This isn't a source of fear, but a source of deep meditative connection. The lady in white has become a central figure in this peaceful coexistence. No longer a fleeting ghost of the corridors, she is now described by those who spend the most time in the house as a stabilizing force, a silent matron whose presence ensures that the energy of the home remains elevated. The library, too, has reached its final form as a sanctuary of silence. The shadow scholar is still there, but the rhythmic tapping and the moving books have evolved into a supportive atmosphere of deep focus. It is said that writers and historians who are allowed into the room find their work progressing with an unnatural speed, as if the house itself is providing them with the answers they seek. This 16th chapter also highlights the global influence of Belcourt on the Newport Renaissance. The success of the restoration has prompted other historic estates to look at their own hauntings not as burdens to be hidden, but as essential parts of their character to be respected. Belcourt has led the way in proving that you can modernize a structure without killing its soul. The massive crystals and copper alignments continue to act as the nervous system of the building, conducting a clean, vibrant energy that visitors can feel as a physical hum the moment they enter the courtyard. This hum is the sound of a house that is no longer at war with itself. The former stables, once a place of dark shadows and heavy dread, are now a masterclass in architectural light, yet they still hold the warm, earthy memory of the horses that started this entire story. The 16th part of our journey serves as a final preparation for the conclusion of this epic narrative. We have seen the house rise as a bachelor's dream, survive as a socialite's fortress, decline into a haunted museum, and finally be reborn as a modern temple of history. The ghosts are no longer entities to be chased or feared. They are the permanent residents of a limestone monument that has finally found its voice. As we look toward the 17th and final part of our series, we will reflect on the ultimate meaning of Belcourt of Newport. It is a story of obsession, of the love for the past, and of the incredible resilience of the human spirit, and the spirits that linger long after the human life has ended. The house stands as a silent sentinel on the Rhode Island shore, a place where every shadow has a name and every stone has a memory. The conversation is nearing its end, but the echoes will last forever. We are standing at the threshold of the final revelation, where the true purpose of Belcourt's long, haunted history will finally be revealed to those who have the patience to listen. As we reach the final threshold of this 17-part chronicle, the story of Belcourt of Newport transcends the mere history of a building and becomes a testament to the enduring power of human legacy and the thinness of the veil that separates the past from our present reality. In the final years of the 2020s, the mansion stands not as a relic of a bygone era, but as a vibrant, breathing entity that has successfully synthesized over a century of disparate energies. This concluding chapter is an exploration of the eternal presence, the realization that the spirits of Belcourt are no longer hauntings in the traditional sense, but are instead an integral part of the home's permanent architecture. The journey that began with Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont's eccentric dream of a castle for his horses has come full circle. The stables, once a dark and heavy sanctuary for beasts and shadow figures, have been transformed into a hall of light, yet they still retain the primal, grounding energy that served as the foundation for everything that followed. Visitors today often speak of a profound sense of completeness as they walk from the courtyard through the grand halls and into the library. It is as if the house itself has finally told its full story, and in doing so, has found a level of peace that was previously unimaginable. The Lady in White and the Shadow Scholar are no longer anomalies to be investigated. They are recognized as the elder residents of the estate, silent guardians who provide a continuity of consciousness in a world that is often too quick to forget. The 16th century armor, the haunted chairs of the tinny era, and the ecclesiastical relics have all left their mark, and though many physical objects have been moved or replaced, their psychic weight remains a part of the atmosphere, like the scent of wood smoke on a winter night. This final part of our history also reflects on the stewardship of Caroline Raphaelian, whose vision allowed the house to heal without stripping away its mystery. By acknowledging the spiritual nature of the building and treating the restoration as a holistic endeavor, she provided a roadmap for how we might interact with our most complicated historical sites in the future. Belcourt has become a beacon for the study of resonant history, proving that a building can be both a modern functional space and a portal to the past. The 16 parts that led us here were filled with scandals, tragedies, and terrifying encounters, but the 17th part is one of resolution. As the sun dipped below the horizon on Bellevue Avenue, casting long, golden shadows across the limestone facade, the voices in the walls do not scream. They hum in a low, harmonious frequency that matches the rhythm of the Atlantic tides. The legacy of the Belmonts, the Vanderbilts, and the Tinneys is now woven into a single, magnificent tapestry that honors every person who ever called this castle home. The hauntings of Belcourt are the echoes of lives lived with an intensity that could not be contained by the span of a single lifetime. They serve as a reminder that our passions, our obsessions, and our love for beauty leave a permanent mark on the world, one that persists long after the flesh has turned to dust. The castle stands as a silent sentinel, a limestone fortress of memory that will continue to watch over Newport for centuries to come. The story of Belcourt is the story of us, our desire to be remembered, our fear of being forgotten, and our eternal connection to the places we build and the dreams we dare to realize. As we conclude this series, we leave Belcourt of Newport as we found it, a place of infinite mystery and profound beauty, where the door between the worlds remains perpetually ajar, inviting those with an open heart to step inside and listen to the stones. The history is written, the spirits are acknowledged, and the castle remains, a timeless monument to the enduring power of the past. The ghosts of Belcourt are not finished. They are simply waiting for the next generation to walk through the doors and join the eternal conversation. This concludes the history of Belcourt, a journey of 60 rooms, 3 centuries, and 1,000 silent witnesses.